Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This is a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, always with the underlying question of how do we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are in relationship presently and across time, human and non-human alike. Today's episode features an interview with Dr. Tim Reed. Right off the bat, I want to encourage you to give this episode a listen, even if you are first judging based on the title that it might not be relevant to you, because as you'll see not too long into the interview, that although we get to a place where we're talking specifically of people with persistent mental illnesses, the baseline, the basis upon which we explore those illnesses is relevant to all of us, and I would imagine quite helpful for anyone who has found themselves triggered. So with that said, I do have an overture for this episode, as I do with all of the episodes. You can read along at jameswjesso.com in the show notes, or you can just listen. Here we go. A Jungian take on mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar, and various forms of persistent psychosis is that they're not rooted in the brain, but rooted in meaning, rooted in our unconscious. These illnesses emerge out of the activation of psychological complexes, or so-called COEX systems, rooted in the deepest recesses of our unconscious mind, where we carry our pre-verbal experiences, our birth experiences, and even our pre-birth experiences, where the personal unconscious merges with the collected unconscious, where the personal mind merges with the archetypal transpersonal. We all share these areas of the mind, and we're all periodically triggered into them. It's just that some of us get stuck in process, and the meaning level of the archetypal invades and dominates the baseline mind, confusing us and at times debilitating us. Furthermore, these same states of mind that we call psychosis arise from the process out of which we encounter states that we call spiritual or mystical experiences or awakenings, be they positive or negative, such as in spiritual crisis. Unfortunately, the modern practice of biological psychiatry is often egregiously underinformed and ill-prepared to support people stuck in process. Thankfully, however, there is a growing shift in both understanding and treatment practice for people stuck in process, and our guest for this episode is one of the people on the leading edge of that shifting understanding and treatment practice. Dr. Tim Reed is a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and author based in London. After degrees in neuroscience and medicine, he was consultant liaison psychiatrist at the Royal London Hospital for 20 years, also heading the crisis intervention service and developing psychological treatments for psychiatric emergencies. He has completed trainings in psychoanalytic psychotherapy and transpersonal psychology with Stanislav Grof. He has been a certified facilitator of holotropic breathwork since 2007. Tim is extensively involved in clinical research of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and with Maria Papaspirou is co-facilitating the Depth Relational Process IPT 2-year training. Tim is the author of Walking Shadows, Archetype and Psyche in Crisis and Growth, co-editor with Jules Evans of Breaking Open, Finding a Way Through Spiritual Emergency, and co-editor with Maria Papaspirou of Psychedelics and Psychotherapy. He joins us on the show to discuss the deep unconscious complexes being triggered and why we need a new way to treat mental illness. We talk about the difference between spiritual crisis and psychosis, how modern psychiatry is broken, and why psychiatrists should undergo psychedelic therapy. Additionally, we explore the difference between being in process and processing, how our triggers are an opportunity to step into our healing journey, the role of relationships in healing, how we can help shift culture and community to better support people in crisis, how to support people in psychotic delusion without colluding with their delusions, and the point at which we should involve psychiatric intervention for people experiencing crisis. So that is the overture to this episode. We're going to get into it very quickly here. But first, I'd like to give a big thanks to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube. It is through the support of my patrons that I am able to reliably invest my time and my financial resources into producing this show and the larger body of work that supports the production of this show. It is truly a blessing to be able to do this thing that I love so deeply and to be able to earn an income doing so on the basis of generosity and the reciprocation of perceived and experienced value. And that is what Patreon is. That is what Patreon offers. And I'm very grateful. So thank you very much, patrons. If you are not yet a patron of the show and you would like to become one, please do head to patreon.com/James W. Jesso. You could also leave a one-time PayPal donation if that is to your fancy, and links to that will be contained in the description of this episode wherever you are checking it out. Thank you so much for supporting the show, be it that you are already supporting or you are about to in this moment. So much appreciated. And without any further ado, here is my interview with Tim Reed on Adventures Through the Mind, episode 172, a Jungian take on psychosis and the healing of our deepest wounds. Enjoy. Okay, Tim Reed, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thank you, James. It's great to be here.
So the reason we're on the call today is that I believe I was initially encountered your work. You were a part of a collection of essays that had gotten put together with Maria Papaspirou. Was it called Psychedelics and Psychotherapy? Is that the name of the book?
I think the book you're referring to is The Psychedelic Mysteries of the Feminine, which is a book that Maria co-edited.
Yeah.
But we've also done a book together called Psychedelics and Psychotherapy.
So that is the book that I was thinking of, Psychedelics and Psychotherapy, that you were a part of, and I read some of your work there. And then I tuned into this excellent webinar you gave through the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy, the IPT, is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah. And the webinar was called Archetypal Crisis and Spiritual Emergency. And it's that topic that I want to explore in the interview today. In that webinar, you kind of outlined that these archetypal crises or spiritual emergencies, these events, are the triggering of a perinatal COEX system wherein we're unable to make ourselves feel safe enough to process that. And this is what I want to explore. But before we start going into that, maybe you could give us a sense specifically of what a COEX system is and what happens when they're triggered.
Okay, so the starting off point is that we have some depths in our psyche that we don't know about, that are very deeply unconscious, and that we don't have a narrative to, that these are pre-verbal parts of our psyche, and that we have elements of our emotional experience that are locked way back in our memories, in our biographical experience. And that these are formative events loaded with meaning that we have erected our psychological defenses around as our ego structures develop. And that some forms of what we might call mental illness really flow from these very powerful pre-verbal primitive elements of mind. The term complex or COEX refers to meaning states that we all have in our psyche. Might be to do with love or loss or abandonment or rejection or shame or guilt or whatever. And we can all identify elements of, say, shame in our adult life, in our recent life, and we can, I'm sure, identify times when we felt shame in our adolescence, our childhood. And we might call this a shame complex or a shame COEX, referring to powerfully charged elements of our psychological experience that have an emotional charge of the same quality. And we call that a complex. Stein Grof took the idea further to include elements of the perinatal experience. And Steingroff famously thought that elements of the process of birth were really important in terms of understanding the roots of mental illness. We can talk a little bit about that later. Other people would say that it's not the birth experience itself, but it's early infantile life when infants are so kind of exposed to, to pain, to hunger, to tummy ache, to the various somatic sensations, and have very intense feelings about this. But the important point to make is that these are really important elements of a very early experience. And the point is that the earliest, deepest roots of each complex or COEX can often be traced back to this very early experience, pre-verbal experience, when feelings are just felt with so much intensity and often feel so overwhelming, so difficult, so uncontainable. And it's these very early wells of experience that people sometimes return to in adult life, and they can be triggered. So you might think of something like Munch's famous painting of the Scream that really captures, I think, the elemental, overwhelming, shapeless, nameless dread that people can access in those states. Now, in most of us in our adult life, we don't really access these states, but sometimes they can be triggered in a way that, for most of us, we can manage. We might barely notice it. For other people, it will trigger something that is very difficult to process, and sometimes people get really locked into a state where they get stuck in process. It's like they have an undigestible lump of psychological material that they can't really work with and get very stuck there.
So please continue, and then I have a clarifying question. Yeah.
So the point I really want to make is that it seems likely that what we understand as mental illness is much more to do with these elemental meaning states and how they're expressed, rather than being down to structural problems in the brain or faulty genes or something like that. So if that is correct, the whole model of psychiatry, of making a diagnosis and matching that to a medical treatment and hope you're eradicating the disease, is fundamentally flawed. And what we should really be looking at is how we can work with these elemental meaning states in a way that is growthful, in a way that's supportive to somebody's health. Because probably the worst thing you can do to somebody is say they've got a horrible mental illness and they need to take medication for the rest of their life, and they're not going to get better. That's the opposite of being supportive.
Yeah, I definitely want to dive into that a little bit more later on, about how this premise that you're presenting here shifts the way we understand mental illness and supporting people in mental illness and the nuances of what that looks like. But first, I want to zoom in a little bit more on, you said complexes, COEX systems. So from my framing of COEX systems, which I have a little bit more on than the Jungian premise of the complex, although I think I might know it well, but I just don't know it well enough to be able to be like, yeah, that's what Jung said or something. But specifically with COEX, what I understand is COEX systems stand for systems of condensed experience. And it's almost like a way in which memories are sort of categorized in the mind according to emotional tone, where the earliest memories we have, which are usually the most intense expressions of that emotional tone, are sort of like the technical word is, I think, cynosure, like the central body around which a system orbits, like the sun in our solar system or Sol in our planetary system. And that what you're speaking to is that there can be experiences where these COEX systems can be triggered, wherein the material, the sort of affective material of these earliest ones and their intensity can sort of become activated. And I want to ask you more about that in a second, but from what I understand, these COEX systems, they're organized where in the sort of most recent memories are kind of like the furthest out of the system. And like the earliest memories are the deepest, most potent, perhaps. And events in our lives can trigger the system and they get sort of logged into the system over time. And we could be triggered to different degrees. So is it possible for one to have a COEX system triggered in a way that isn't as intense as what we'll talk about later in the archetypal spiritual crisis phenomenon? And when that is triggered, what does processing it look like?
So I could give you a couple of examples. I think one of them you've probably heard before, because when you came to that talk that you referred to, I just had my car broken into and my laptop was stolen. And as well as my laptop being in my bag, there was my notebook and my diary. So it was a significant event, and I did what anybody would do. You make the situation safe, you sort the car out, you take the necessary safety precautions. And then the following day, I was relaxing for the first time in the summer sunshine, having done what needed to be done, relaxed the first time, and found myself going into an unusual mental state, which really felt quite dark and quite difficult to navigate. And I recognized straight away that this was not part of my it was outside the range of feelings that I would normally have. And what had happened was, as I relaxed, my psyche opened a little bit. I thought to myself, and the thought that came to me was that my diary and my notebook were maybe in somebody else's hands, and maybe somebody looked at what I'd written and was laughing at it. So that's an example of a trigger. So that was a trigger, something to do with being exposed, vulnerable, maybe a bit of shame. So that resonated, you could say, right down the COEX system, and probably took me right back to an early pre-verbal kind of experience, because we all have these mental states locked in our psyche. The mental state I've just described is common to every single one of us, although we're not usually aware of it. So I had the opportunity of revisiting that mental state, and it was discombobulating and difficult and quite unpleasant. And it took me a little while to regain my perspective and figure out what was going on, reorientate myself, use my breathing, self-compassion, some curiosity. Hey, what just happened there? And then, having reorientated yourself, you're making yourself safe. You're decreasing the intensity of what you're feeling. But it's actually better than that. It's also an opportunity to go to a well of something in your psyche that could maybe do a little bit more processing. So it's the sort of thing that we might help somebody with in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, for example, where the invitation is always to lean into something with a little more curiosity and compassion. Whatever comes up is good, is kind of growthful, although it may seem challenging. So that's an example of how, a trigger in the mild to moderate range related to an experience which is a little bit outside the everyday range of experience, but is not such a big deal in the overall scheme of things, can cause some ripples. And if you think about it, I think we can all find examples of similar things like that in our daily lives. I was in an airport the other day. The plane was delayed by a few hours because of weather. We were corralled in a confined space, having gone through check-in. We kind of knew the airline was telling lies to us about how long it would take, and that and something slightly similar happened. And I fairly soon figured out that this was like a reenactment of early parenting difficulties. You're in a caregiver who is not telling the truth, who's unempathic, they're looking after their own narcissistic needs, what's right for a corporation rather than what's right for passengers. And it's just quite interesting to watch what's going on. So rather than being taken unawares by the psychological energy that's flowing through you, the meaning states that are flowing through you, it can come a little bit more into vision, and so it can be helpful and interesting rather than potentially threatening. If you're vulnerable, then these things can really take you by surprise. They can, sweep you off your feet. If it's part of your early experience that caregiving was not safe, and part of your early experience was that you have very acute senses of danger, for example, then a paranoid state might be triggered. If your early experience involves a state of futility and despair, which again I think we all have locked inside us somewhere. Some people get into those states very deeply and can't get out. Some people go into states where they feel, if they're triggered in a certain way, rather than feel sadness or difficult feelings, they might feel beyond all difficult feelings. So they might start feeling omnipotent or overpowerful or grandiose or happy in a way that isn't realistic, something that might resemble what we call a manic state.
So one of the things that I'm hearing you speak to is that it is the case that events that have similar emotional tones, or like on like a pattern level rather than on the specific level of the content itself, are familiar enough to early experiences in the feeling tone and in the scenario just to trigger an activation of old unresolved emotional energies, or energies that are left over from being in a younger state where one is more powerless, or so on and so forth, and that the activation, that triggering sort of can flood the system, flood one's experience with this sort of excessive history. And I think I'm concluding what you're saying here correctly is, start to influence and even alter one's sense of what is happening, to being guided by the past, what one perceives as well as how one behaves, being guided by this heavily charged young stuff, rather than responding to the present scenario with a sort of like contextually appropriate adult response. And that when those things happen, this triggering could actually be a very positive opportunity to be doing some sort of energy management or emotional management that can help sort of support our skill sets in passing through triggered moments, or even in psychedelic experiences, start to remap how those emotions reveal themselves in similar scenarios in the future. Am I picking up what you're putting down there?
Oh, I think you're putting it really well. I really like the way you're putting that. In terms of early experience, if you look at a baby in distress, there's no doubt that baby is in the grip of very extreme emotions. And with a very young baby, the bad stuff is all out there. The baby feels that they're being attacked by the outside world. Psychoanalysts call that the paranoid position, and it's a normal part of human development. And usually the baby starts to realize that the part of the outside world, the mother that's causing distress, is also the same mother that holds and protects and feeds. So the baby is able to move on from that paranoid, from that paranoid stance. But sometimes they can't, and sometimes people go back to that paranoid state. And if they feel a sense of distress in the adult world, they get catapulted back to the sense that the world's attacking them in a very hostile way. And I think this lies behind the sort of paranoid states that we come across in psychiatry. And the second point you made is really the move from being in process to processing. So we're all triggered into process. It's part of being human, that we get triggered in a way, and that we become reacquainted with unresolved elements of our past. Of course, it does, but for most of the time, we can then move into processing. We can start to figure out what's going on. But the key step there is going from process to processing. That's the absolutely key step. And some people can't do that. They get completely stuck in process. They get very identified with their mental states. They can't take a meta perspective. So, in psychedelic therapy, it'd be like somebody not coming down from a psychedelic journey. It would be like somebody completely identifying with the contents of their psychedelic journey.
And now, if I just jump in, I think what I'm hearing you say is, if one can't sort of make the shift from in process to processing, and I think there's maybe a question that's not being asked right now about what it looks like to be in processing and what's required to process effectively. But like, if one can't make that shift, the sort of maybe the window of activation will eventually close, and whatever mental state, scenario, logic, whatever sort of, I recently heard the term like a kind of psychologic. It's logical. It's very logical, but it's logical based on a very specific interpretation, which isn't necessarily reflective of the actuality of what's happening. That as that window of opportunity closes, the sort of mental state, the logic, etc., one's identity, one's perception of the world gets tightened. Rather than a healing or processing happening, it gets tightened and reaffirmed and reinforced. Is that correct? That's one of the notes that I took, but yes. I don't remember if you spoke it correctly or specifically. Yeah.
Yes. So that's our best guess at what happens with mental illness, with psychiatric disorders. That people just get very stuck in process, and their ways of being in the world get hardwired. A relationship with the world around them, and people starts to reinforce their unusual mental states and the opportunity to move on in a way that's reparative, that's constructive, that's growthful, and becomes lost.
I mean, well, hold on. Could this not also happen in people who objectively appear to be relatively functional from a can do their work in the world? Like there's a big difference between, like, there's a broad range of what constitute normal before we go into the realm of mental illness. I mean, depending on which version of the DSM you're referencing from. But is it not possible that people could be stuck in a sort of mild expression of this very same thing, but are sort of presenting as normal, but they're actually stuck in process around old wounds that just don't manifest extremely enough to have others be concerned about their mental health?
Yeah. Well, I think you're talking about all of us in that sense.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
And it reminds me of the Plato's cave story, where we're all looking at the shadows that are projected onto the back of a cave, and we take that as our normal reality. But our normal reality is mediated by our conditioning, our early experience, our sensual and our sensory systems. But if we get very identified with those images at the back of the cave. So there's something about turning our gaze away from those images, and something about taking ourselves away from our conditioning that leads us through that very problematic journey up the cave, through with an encounter with our early experience, our conditioning, the deeper parts of our psychic structures, and it's pretty intense and difficult. But if we can do that, we have the opportunity of going into the light outside the cave, which is so much richer, has a greater bandwidth of conscious experience. Plato described it as colourful and three-dimensional in comparison to the black and white flickering images in the back of a cave. And it might be that speaks to the fundamental challenges of our human journey. How can we disidentify with our process? How can we disidentify with the narratives that were given to us? How can we unstick ourselves? How can we take a different perspective on the narratives that kind of keep us confined?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I'm wondering about too is you said, like, how can we? Well, that's a question. Like, how can we? Like, what does processing look like? And how does the needs of any particular processing process relative to a particular COEX system, how do we determine what variables we need to be in that processing? Because my assumption is it isn't always just us thinking our way out of it. by ourselves. So maybe don't worry about my little qualifier there, but why don't you give me a sense of what processing kind of looks like generally?
Well, I think our wounds are a really important part of that, because if we were just happy and content and we had no wounds, then we would float along quite happily with our everyday life. So the story of the hero's journey is quite helpful here. That there's usually some sort of wound, there's usually a crisis, and that causes us to look for other answers. There's the wonderful story of Jack and the Beanstalk. I'm thinking of that in particular because it's often a pantomime that's performed at this time of year in the UK in the Christmas season, and it's the story of Jack, who's quite a simple lad. He lives with his mother, and they have an economic crisis, and they're poor. And mother tells Jack to take the cow to market to sell it, and it's their only possession. And Jack takes the cow to market, but he meets the manifestation of a trickster archetype who says that he will take Jack's cow off his hands in exchange for a bag of magic beans. And Jack accepts this. He takes his beans home to his mother, who's appalled at what he's done. And it seems like a disastrous decision. But then, of course, he throws the magic beans out the window. The magic beanstalk erupts, and he goes on a journey to the high place, which is a symbol of transformation. And in going to that high place, he meets a dreadful giant who wants to eat him. He meets the manifestation of the archetypal feminine, which is the giant's wife. He's able to withstand the adventures. He doesn't get eaten by the giant, which is important. Some people would get eaten by the giant and maybe end up in a psychiatric hospital or something like that. And he has the growthful experience of returning back with the goose that lays the golden eggs, which is a wonderful kind of archetypal symbol of the fruits of the expanded state, the fruits of a high journey. If you can take back something with you that continues to enrich you from within. But the point is, Jack wouldn't have got there. He wouldn't have gone that magical journey if he hadn't taken a chance. If there hadn't been some sort of crisis, and he took a chance. He could have bypassed the trickster archetype. He could have gone to the market. He could have continued to have a suburban existence. He could have sold a cow for a bit of money, and he could have he could have turned down the opportunity for that developmental journey.
Or could have chosen not to do the terrifying climb up the beanstalk.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And not many people are up for that climb up the beanstalk.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then, I mean, I see this. I appreciate the story as a sort of a representation, a mythological representation of what this looks like. But what might it look like on a more sort of like actual standpoint? Like, what kind of things? Like, for example, if you don't mind sharing, what kind of things did you do when you realized, the day after you calmed down, when your laptop was stolen and you're like, oh, I'm going into this expanded place, when you switched from in process to processing, what did some of the things that you did to process look like? And what might generally they look like for people? Because I'm thinking from the perspective of someone's going to listen to this show, they're going to possibly be like, oh yeah, this, but they might be like, oh wow, this, I wonder what this could be. And I want them to be able to walk away with some sort of sense of what it might look like on an easily accessible end to recognize oneself as being in process and to switch into processing.
Yes, that's a good question. So there's something about being aware of what's coming up in you and being open and curious and as compassionate as you can be. Because so often when difficult stuff comes up, we feel shame or guilt, or we should not be having these feelings. And often the difficult material that gets accessed is kind of nameless. It feels dark, sticky, treacly, feels shitty often. So it's difficult stuff to stay with. So if you can cultivate an attitude of curiosity and compassion, the sort of things that we encourage in psychedelic therapy. So maybe one of the first things to do is to calm yourself down, because often, you get some signs of physiological hyperarousal, you feel a bit distressed, maybe the breathing gets a bit quicker. And, our instinct is always to go and do something else. It might be to have a drink or exercise or some sort of distracting activity. But so often it's just a wonderful opportunity just to sit with yourself and think, hey, what's going on here? I'm just a human being. I've been triggered. It's not my fault. The feelings I'm feeling of shamefulness, they are just feelings. They are just feelings. Let's see if we can take the opportunity to find out a little bit more about them. It's really important to make sure that you're in a safe place. So, if you're having these feelings in a crowded place, like a transportation hub or out in the streets, it's much harder. So you want to make sure that you're in a safe, comfortable place. The more supported you can feel, the more comfortable that process is going to be.
I'm thinking about this man. He wrote a book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow, and it has to do with grief. His name's Francis Weller, and one of the things that I'm remembering is something to the effect of, grief is always too much for one person to hold. And that likely, and I think I might be filling in my own ideas here, but that likely is a consequence of us as a species, as emotional beings, we did not actually evolve to be isolated individuals. So one of the things that I could infer between the lines on what you're saying, but wasn't explicitly said, was the role of other people in this feeling of safety and in this processing process. And I don't necessarily mean a therapist, but it could be a therapist. I'm curious where you see the role and the function of other people in our processing, both with respect to the calming down and with respect to the ability to effectively utilize the window of opportunity this being in process and processing offers for a kind of some sort of positive resolution.
Yeah. So we see relationship absolutely at the heart of everything. The training for psychedelic therapists that Maria Papasperu and I are developing at the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy, we call our training depth relational process training, because we don't think you can really do this work outside the context of a relationship. The work that's going on in psychedelic assisted therapy in all the clinical trials, one element that is becoming crystal clear to all of us involved in this work is the crucial role of the therapist, the co-therapist, and that the most powerful factor outside the drug treatment itself is the therapeutic relationship. And one of the most healing and powerful things that happens is if people are taken back to the difficult, powerful early states that we've been talking about in the context of the co-therapist pair. So something about the combination of going back to those really difficult places, but also being really held and supported by therapists who've got their hearts full of love, and that seems to be the crucial fundamental component. Now, if you compare that to psychiatric hospitals, to the sort of reception that people get if they present in crisis, mentally ill, staff at psychiatric units go into their profession because they have a vocation to work with people with mental health problems. They're generally good people, but they're super hard pressed. The systems are generally unsympathetic. It's really, really difficult to give people in crisis the support, the time, the compassion, the curiosity that's most likely to be helpful for them. And to compound that difficulty, we've been so handicapped by this fundamentally flawed model of medical psychology, that somebody has a medical problem, that they're kind of specimens, the doctor as the white-coated individual who comes along and makes a dispassionate diagnosis, take the medication, maybe have some CBT or something, which is the antithesis, if you like, of a sort of relationship that's more likely to be helpful.
I don't know if this is the place for this question, but I'm going to ask it anyways.
Go for it.
It's something like, what does it look like and what does it take for us to be building relationships with each other and within community where we're able to be supportive with each other during our processing times? Because it seems, and I don't mean this to the point of the extreme, because I want to ask you more about supporting someone in an extreme expression of this, but I mean this from like a sort of everyday, because the reality is, it's like most of us aren't going to have a psychotic episode or an archetypal crisis. Several of us will, but most of us won't. But every single one of us will be triggered, and what does it look like to, with others and in community, build relationships that are aware and supportive of this kind of thing with each other?
That's a great question. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think there's a whole stack of us who are having conversations like this, and hopefully the momentum is that we're just becoming a little more emotionally articulate, a little more connected. The sort of work that you're doing, there's a whole stack of us who are trying to make a bit of an impact on this path. The psychedelic renaissance hopefully puts. It hopefully has a general effect of heart opening. I'm not saying that psychedelic renaissance is the answer to all these questions, and there are some people who become casualties of that as well. I wouldn't want to underplay that, but it might be very helpful in psychiatry, because in psychedelic assisted therapy, it doesn't matter what your credentials are, your qualifications are, your medical training. It's more how you are as a human being getting into a minefield with a participant and really being present and honoring their experience. And if we can do that for each other a little more than we have been doing, then that would be a step in the right direction. There's a political element to this. There's a social element to this. There's a whole conversation to be had about inequality, about how we are with each other.
Economics as well.
Economics, yeah. So it's a broad front. Sorry. That's
okay. No need to apologize. You're the one that I am showcasing, so your voice is the one I intend to amplify. So I just want to share with you this sort of funny arc in my mind, knowing where you were going with the respect of it's the impact it could have on psychiatry. Where you went was exactly where I had the sense you were going, and maybe it's a little trickster part of me made a little joke. I mean, it could have an incredible impact on psychiatry by giving psychiatrists psychedelic therapy.
Yeah.
Because of I think there's a real sense that when we're in a psychedelic experience and we really sometimes very intensely feel the difference between a warm smile and being alone or somebody who's indifferent to us, that really has an impact, at least it has for me, in the sense of my understanding of how important subtle human gestures of humanity with each other, we'll say small gestures of humanity with each other, impact others in times when they're in vulnerable state. Yeah. And my experience with psychiatry personally is that there didn't seem to be a lot of that. And the feedback I've heard from many others is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of that there.
I'm afraid that's right. And in some ways, it's quite surprising, because most people that go into psychiatry are pretty good people. They're decent people, and they want to make a difference, and they care deeply about their patients. I think there's a major problem with the model. Most psychiatrists don't do work on themselves. Most psychiatrists don't examine their own psyche. They have no knowledge of the deep psyche. They're trained in a medical model, which is still with symptom recognition and the making of a diagnosis. They're not trained to think about meaning. So the meaning of somebody's symptoms is not thought to be relevant. If you have a certain type of hallucination, that indicates a certain diagnostic label, and you go down the treatment pathway. It used to be thought that if somebody has psychotic symptoms, they'd probably got schizophrenia. And the model was that schizophrenia needs to be eradicated by a course of medication, probably for a couple of years. And often the doses of medication were high. Now, we know now that it doesn't work like that. Schizophrenia is not, it does not have a biological basis, and that the psychiatric medications actually cause a lot more harm than we ever knew. Now, it's quite an extraordinary situation that we have such a flawed model, but so many people, including myself, were trained in that model, and people's careers are based on it. There's a whole kind of power hierarchy that is based on it. People's status, their pensions, the whole, system of academic psychiatry is a bit like a pyramid scheme. So you get people who are invested in the politics of academic research, and obviously they are going to support their own findings. They're going to support financial grants for other people doing similar research. These people are not going to say, "Sorry, I was wrong." The premises that we've been investigating for the last couple of generations have not been promising or helpful. I think we have to hope that the new generation of psychiatrists coming through will see things differently. Hasn't happened yet. I think that might be one of the spin-offs of psychedelic research. That people will become more interested in meaning states, will become more interested in the deep psyche, and will be able to work with people in a different way, in a more kind of spacious, facilitative sort of way.
I want to come back to the comment you made about schizophrenia a little bit later, but now I want to get more deeply, like very specifically, spotlight on like spiritual crisis, archetypal crisis, and its, and I think it was a word I'm looking for, like etiology, like the root sort of central cause of the illness being somewhere around a COEX system of early pre-verbal or perinatal nature being activated in an extreme way. But before I ask you about that, I want very specifically just your description of what a spiritual crisis you said archetypal crisis or spiritual emergency looks like. What it looks like.
So the term spiritual emergency became very popular in the 60s, 70s in the transpersonal community, especially in the States. And it works particularly well for people who are involved in a spiritual practice, maybe have a meditation practice or whatever. And through that practice, they access the problematic parts of the psyche we've been talking about. And it seems that in any profound spiritual practice, this is kind of what happens. If you go on a 10-day Vipassana retreat, there's probably going to be a time in that retreat where you go into a really dark and sticky place that's going to be difficult, but generally people come out the other side. But some people don't. Christina Groff famously had a very difficult process that seemed to be triggered by her experience of giving birth to her children, and she experienced a sense of a titanic energy that felt like electricity coursing through her body, and that was associated with images and visions and very difficult emotional experiences. And she sought help from Stan Groff, who tried to support her through that. In terms of the analogy of Plato's cave that we were talking about earlier, you have the person who turns their view away from consensus reality. They do the difficult journey up through the cave, encounter with their conditioning. They go into the multi-dimensional, richly textured land outside the cave. They might have an experience of cosmic unity. But then it's very difficult going back into the cave and explaining their experience to the cave dwellers, and the cave dwellers might turn against them. And I think this is something that we find, in psychiatry, where people sometimes have high-level spiritual experiences that are, that are very difficult to digest, difficult to talk about, and get profoundly misunderstood. We see this. You have patients brought into the emergency room, for example, with a sense of they have seen God. They had an experience of cosmic unity, but they get confused to the point that they think that they are the new Messiah, that they are immortal. Maybe they're engaged in really dangerous behavior, like wandering around in traffic to test their hypothesis of immortality. So sometimes people get really, really badly confused in these states. I hope that answers your question.
I think so. So the symptoms, the objective symptoms of somebody being in a spiritual emergency is not too dissimilar from the symptoms one might describe of a psychotic episode. Is that correct? Like a psychotic or a manic episode? Except that there's certain qualities that are associated to sort of like encountering a spiritual experience?
Yeah, so the sort of experience that that an accomplished meditator might have, or people who get described as saints, as saint or a mystic, the experiences that they have might be the same as an experience that somebody that has a diagnosis of mania has, except the person with mania will not come down from it and won't be able to digest or assimilate this experience. They probably accessed the same element of the collective unconscious, but it's too much for them. It's like they've had an overdose of meaning that has become really dangerous for them. The experienced meditator will often spend years getting to this place, and will be supported in this.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of fishing for an answer in a way, because maybe this is a later thing, but it seems like a sort of cloudy area where it's like, okay, psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, spiritual emergency, archetypal crisis requiring actual pharmaceutical psychiatric intervention versus needing a different kind of support and telling the difference and so on and so forth. And I want to ask you about that a bit afterwards, but I think I was slightly sort of fishing for some sort of description, like, yeah, it's kind of looks like psychosis, but it's not, which I didn't get, which is, I think, warrant self-inquiry for myself. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's pretty much the same. It might be simpler to break it down into crisis and unresolved crisis. So spiritual emergency, psychosis look pretty much the same when they first present. But they, it can take many different forms. But basically, people have been triggered into some sort of process, and then if it stays stuck in that processing doesn't happen, and people stay stuck, then it kind of it becomes concretized into the shapes that we're familiar with, and that get labeled as mental illnesses. So the characteristic states of paranoia, confusion, disintegration, depression, and mania. But the diagnostic labels that we give are just descriptions of symptoms. It's not like it is not like an illness that responds to a certain treatment program. It's just somebody's got really, really stuck and can't move out of the state that they find themselves in. Is there any difference between the question is can you distinguish between what starts off as a spiritual emergency and a psychosis? I've come to the conclusion that you probably can't. It all starts off the same. It all depends on the ability to make that crucial move from process to processing. So there are huge questions for kind of mental health services, in that when people first present, that's the moment of maximum opportunity. That's when you kind of throw everything at this distressed individual who's in such a critical state where it really could go either way. And these are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves. How can we work most effectively with people in this sort of crisis? Because if we don't do that, they have a much higher chance of getting stuck.
Hmm. And do you see there being, like, from what you're describing about the failures of our medical model and those failures looking like people who otherwise would not get stuck if they had the right kind of support getting stuck? Does this apply the same for you? Like, okay, we're talking about psychosis, okay, but like, does that apply the same for you in people who seem to be presenting with bipolar disorder? Like, is bipolar disorder, a failure of relational response and processing rather than something that is sort of wired into the brain? And so, like, is your proposition that, like, all things that we would describe as mental illnesses are just an issue with processing, or is it such that some of these conditions are things that are rooted somewhere in the biology and are assisted with psychiatric medications?
Yeah. So that's been a question that has preoccupied psychiatry for as long as we know. So when Jung was working in psychiatry, he thought there were certain conditions like bipolar disorder, like schizophrenia, which was called dementia precox, and that they were biological. In American psychiatry, before, in the 50s and 60s, the perspective was very psychoanalytical, and these psychiatric disorders were very much understood in terms of psychological processes. And then the last couple of generations, the view has been overwhelmingly that these are biological conditions. But we know now that there's no evidence that they're biological conditions. So, for example, there's very little evidence. So there's been a huge meta-analysis of genetic research done recently. It's called Schema, and they looked at 25,000 people with diagnosis of schizophrenia, 100,000 normal controls, and they found that there were some genes, I think about 10 genes, that had some association with abnormal mental states, but at most that could only account for 5%. Obvious case of schizophrenia. So I think you can't say that it looks likely that some people are wired in a way that might make them more predisposed to getting stuck. It might be that they get more physiologically aroused, they're more impulsive, they're less able to move from process to processing. But it seems, and we also know from programs like the open dialogue approach that there are certain psychological approaches that have been very successful in doing early in working with people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and that if you and if you use a psychological approach in a sympathetic way, engaging family members, friends, and you're seeking to look at the root causes, then that's often very helpful. And in Finland, where this approach was pioneered, there have been claims that schizophrenia has been pretty much eradicated.
Wow, that's wild. Yeah, I think this is a little too far out into the reads. No pun intended. But I have a question about, like, keeping the person safe, if their schizophrenia is presenting as harm or self-harm, and then what it looks like to be in that kind of sort of like relational supportive process when there's potential for harm or violence involved. But maybe I'll just leave that aside, and maybe it'll come up again later. I want to go back into your premise of these crises being activated COEX systems. So we talked quite a bit about the COEX systems, and you had mentioned that they're similar to complexes, which is they start, very early in life. And the earliest life, the pre-verbal ones, are the most strongly charged, because then that's when we're the most uncontained in our emotional expression. And these are also times where they're pre-verbal, which means we have in the memory of the experience and the sort of root of the systems, we have like no conceptual capacity to explain these things, to explicate these feelings in a way that puts them in time and place and context. They're just or something. And then you had also mentioned the sort of unique contribution of Stanislav Grof in this work to suggest that these systems, these complexes, don't start in early life. They actually start during the different phases of the birthing process, and that the birthing process itself is that same sort of pre-verbal emotional charge, etc., but at a different level of maybe expansiveness or intensity. And you made the suggestion that these states are activated COEX systems where people get stuck in process, very early activated states. And in your discussion on the webinar that sort of initiated me reaching out, you discussed the role of the perinatal activation. And I'm wondering if you can, I guess what would be necessary is a little bit of a flush out about the perinatal matrices, I believe they're called, and where you see spiritual emergency archetypal crisis as being, rooted down as far into the perinatal system.
So I was trained by Steingroff, and I'm an admirer of his work. I think he's a great man, and he's the original LSD psychotherapist from the 1950s and 60s, and he's worked with more people in LSD psychotherapy than anybody else. I think he's personally sat for a couple of thousand sessions and supervised many others. And when he was collating his work in the early 1970s and going through his case records, he developed idea. He thought that at the root of people's issues was what he called the perinatal layer. And he wasn't the first person to have this idea, but he developed the ideas further than anyone else. And this was contrary to the ideas coming up in psychoanalysis, which considered that the baby is born with no experience of being in the womb, no experience of the birth process, and that personality development starts with the relationship with mother, the feeding relationship at the breast. But Grof felt that this was profoundly wrong, and found that there were many kind of elements of experience that relates to the perinatal process that emerged in people's experiences in expanded states. And the first part of the perinatal experience is the experience of being in the womb, of being supported in the womb, close to maternal heartbeat. It's probably pretty blissful. You're getting everything that you need in this watery environment. Sometimes it's not so blissful, a toxic wound state, especially as labor approaches. And then you get this sudden cataclysmic change as labor starts. You have a contracting uterus in the baby, and just imagine what it's like for that baby who, has very limited experience, but is subjected to these incredible forces, and that would feel like a pretty dreadful situation to be in, and there would be a sense of threat to survival. And if you can imagine, the baby at that time has got no words, no cognitions, but it feels, it would feel pretty dreadful, and you'd really feel it with your body. And then, of course, there's the journey down the birth canal, with everything that would involve. And and then the expulsion into the outside world, which of course is like a death to the old world and a rebirth in the new world, the bright lights, everything that goes with that. Hopefully some of the harshness of that experience can be mitigated, but often it's still a pretty harsh experience. So the main elements of that would be the transition from one state to another, the birth, the experience of death, the fundamental experience of crushing futility, of powerlessness, of incredible forces raged against you, the journey through birth canal, that life and death struggle, the forces in your body, emergence in the new world. So you can just imagine. Imagine the enormity of that. Now, I think that Groff really made a lot of the perinatal experience. It was his thing, if you like. It was what kind of made him famous. He thought that he'd identified a really important part of the human psychic experience that other people didn't. I think Groff probably was, and he was very interested in archetypal and transpersonal experience. He wasn't so interested in relational experience. He wasn't particularly interested in what happened after birth. He wasn't really that interested in the vicissitudes of, the infant's relationship with mother. I've worked with Groff. He wasn't that interested in the relational setting. So I think Groff's work has to be taken in context. He was a genius who cast a very sharp light on a certain element of the early experience, but in doing that, maybe there's an element of overstating that particular case, and maybe there's some neglect of the relational side of things that we think is so important in the current rollout of psychedelic work.
So one of the things, this is me going to try to tie in to what your premise in the webinar here, is that part of what Groff realized was in doing the work with these people who were under sometimes very large amounts of LSD, they would have experiences that were well beyond the personal. And that he found that they actually mapped over these 4 different stages in the birth process, which he calls the matrices, the 1, 2, 3, and 4, union, hell without escape, struggle, and then I think the term used reemergence or emergence. And that he suggested that these experiences aren't experiences that we would have a kind of memory of, that we would remember being a baby or being in the womb necessarily. Yeah. So the way they would manifest would be through archetypal imagery. So they would manifest as oceanic boundlessness in union with the Godhead or something, or they would manifest as being literally in a hell and being powerless against the demons that are attacking you, or or having experiences of whole civilizations rising, in revolution against a totalitarian government, experiencing yourself as this entire revolution or something in the third, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that you suggested in your webinar, which I thought was very insightful and very interesting, was the sort of intensity of the what's like the narrative or the experiences that people are getting stuck in an archetypal crisis or a spiritual crisis, that there's a sort of grandeur of these things. I'm Jesus, or I'm God, or whatever it might be. This is obviously a very accessible and extreme example. Are expressions of them being stuck perhaps in an experience so early that they're almost stuck in being in process of a perinatal root, and it's expressing in archetypal ways. Am I remembering that correctly? And could you either correct me or flesh that out a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I think we can get a bit too hung up on where these experiences where they originate from. And I don't think it really matters whether it's kind of perinatal or infantile. I think in many ways it's an academic distinction. I've been doing a lot of work with people in holotropic breath work over a period of time, and you get to know their processes quite well. And the most important thing that seems to happen is they go to their scary places. The places that are really difficult to go to, and they can often only get to if they feel really well supported and their psyche is able to open that to that point. And they go to these places that that have been holding reservoirs of energy probably for all their lives, and that they've erected all their defenses around. Now, it really doesn't matter if that originates from the birth experience or from very early life. It might have roots in both. And in some ways, it's unhelpful to be too cognitive about it. My experience of Groff was, he would do these extraordinary lectures, and he would talk for pretty much a whole day, and he'd show lots of slides with very evocative archetypal imagery. And I think, in a way, we were a little conditioned to have similar experiences. And to construe some of our experiences as perinatal in a way that was not always helpful for processing, because the really important thing is just to really fully, deeply feel it, not just emotionally but also somatically, because so much energy is locked up in what the body feels through as well. And if the body is allowed to express itself in the way that it needs to, that's often really that's often at least as powerful as allowing yourself to feel what you're feeling from an emotional perspective. So I'm getting a bit, I hope I'm not moving too far away from your question here. I just wanted to make the point that, the important thing is to really go into that feeling state, and really it doesn't, the distinction about where it comes from is often not particularly helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point. I appreciate you you bringing it in. Then I want to ask, this is sort of like a reiteration of my previous question, now at a different level of understanding of your perspective, and I feel having learned as well, is towards, you call it an archetypal crisis. So you are suggesting that there's a crisis of some sort of something that seems to be expressed in archetypal means. So can you unpack a little bit about what your thoughts are with respect to the emergence or experiencing of archetypal level things when we're in that sort of crisis, stuck in process thing?
So when we go back to these very early places and experience them fully, it seems to act as a portal to archetypal transpersonal experience. So we go beyond our ego structures, and I think we move into a more archetypal element of consciousnness, which goes beyond ego, and which is transpersonal, and has an extraordinary intensity of meaning. So we feel things much more intensely. So if you think of our brain, our psychic structures are kind of formed to hold us within a certain level of meaning, so we can function, so we don't feel things too intensely. And of course, when we go into expanded states, whether through psychological crisis or psychedelics or holotropic breathwork or something, then we go beyond we go beyond the parameters of meaning that usually confine us. We feel things so much more intensely. So there seems to be something about going back to those very early meaning states in our biographical existence that allows us to actually move beyond our biographical existence and move into something which lies beyond the personal.
And the crisis has to do with people getting sort of stuck up there in a way. Their experience of life now is being almost primarily filtered through the lens of the archetypal experience, now sort of like forcibly tried to be constrained into a state of consciousness, which is the relational, everyday world where it doesn't necessarily fit or belong, which generates, I assume, extreme amounts of distress, not to mention all the consequences of being out of attunement with the sort of the functional, pragmatic realities of the relational, non-transpersonal world.
So these high-level archetypal states are very potent and very powerful. Extraordinary experiences of love and cosmic unity, and you can see that everything is connected. You might see that the structures that we normally take for granted are just structures erected by our cognitive structures, and we can see a much deeper level of being. Now, if you have these sudden realizations, how do you take that back to everyday reality? There's that wonderful expression after the ecstasy, the laundry. We need to go back to doing the laundry. We can't stay in these ecstatic states. But there's also something about grieving. We've talked about manic states a bit. There's something about a manic state that is impervious to grief, but can't go to the grief place. Where when we do work on ourselves, where it's inevitable that we're going to access grief, and we need to be able to, we need to allow that grief to flow. In a psychedelic session, if you see somebody weeping, you know that good stuff is happening. Something is flowing, something is being accessed, something's resolved. There's some movement there. If grief doesn't happen, if people stay in that high place, and the grief doesn't happen, then that can be problematic.
So, I want to get into a couple practical questions. My first assumption, and I think it's a fair one, is that for people who are in spiritual crisis or entering into one, chances are it would be ideal for them to be in a therapeutic relationship with somebody who is skilled and experienced in supporting people through spiritual emergency, archetypal crisis. I know that IPT, I believe, anyways, has a collection of therapists that they do. You have like a what's the word I'm looking for? Not a Rolodex. Anyway, something to that effect. Yeah.
So we have a database of psychotherapists who are familiar with and comfortable working with expanded states. So people who've had difficulty navigating a psychedelic experience, or people who kind of relate to the spiritual emergency model. Yeah.
So apart from aging myself by saying Rolodex instead of database, so that said, it is the case that that often people, so even people listening, that kind of access, be it financial limitation or otherwise, isn't necessarily available, or at the very least, the average person listening here might end up being the first line of response, like first line responders to someone going through this kind of situation. And so I have a couple of questions about that in particular. The first one is, barring access to an online facilitation with one of the people that you have in your database, is there a point at which the support team in that person's life, the first line responders in the relationships, is there a point at which it actually makes sense to have this person be taken care of in a psychiatric institution or through psychiatric means? Like, how do we tell the difference between, okay, they just need some support for a little while and they're going to be okay, and actually this is at a point where it's getting quite dangerous, and before it gets there, is there a warrant for psychiatric intervention, and how do we tell the difference?
I think people know when a situation is getting unsafe, and safety is paramount. So if there's a question as to safety, that's where psychiatry comes in. If somebody is not sleeping, somebody hasn't slept for a couple of nights, then that's going to really impair their ability to process. Sometimes people get very stuck in that way. Impaired sleep, impaired concentration, not eating properly. Then some psychiatric help might very well be required. If people are exceeding the limits of their containing structures. I think it's generally fairly clear to people when things are getting out of hand. And it's also important to not let ideology get in the way of sensible decisions. And the right medication can really help. If experiences are overwhelming and safety is a problem, then medication can really help. There's a place for medication. What we know about medication now, though, is that long-term medication is much less likely to be helpful. Short courses of appropriately targeted medication have a place, but we need to be clear what we're doing with that medication. If you medicate somebody, then you're going to impair their ability to process for a while. But if they're not processing anyway, that's not a problem. Maybe the processing can come later.
Sure, once they get some sleep, for example.
Yes. I mean, I was hearing today about someone in a psychedelic trial who had a very challenging psychedelic experience that was probably really important, but really wasn't able to sleep for a few days afterwards and got very agitated and responded really, really well to a few days of pretty light medication, and was then able to get back into processing and then made a huge amount of progress and is doing really well.
I think well, first off, I really appreciate you saying that, because I've known people who have found, literally, it seems as though their lives were saved. Either, their lives were saved because they got put on the right psychiatric medication.
Yeah.
And, perhaps if they had open dialogue or so on and so forth, they might not have needed to be on that medication. Perhaps if the world were different, it'd be different and we'd have different options available to us, but nonetheless, their lives were saved. And at least as it stands. And so I really appreciate you saying that, because especially your comment around, let's not let ideology get in the way of what was your phrase there? Let's not let ideology get in the way of
common sense.
Right. Yeah. So the reason I say that is because I have seen from the outside, and I've gotten feedback from people, because I do integration coaching for some people, where, there are times where I say, I feel like it probably wouldn't be a bad idea for you to talk to your doctor about these things. It sounds like it's getting to a pretty intense place. And if you're having these kinds of experiences and you're getting to the place where you're contemplating harm, I don't think you should hesitate calling the crisis line or checking yourself into a hospital. It's all great that we want to try to work these things out otherwise, but the sort of feedback I'm getting that people are having experiences in online psychedelic communities where it's almost like they're failures. They're just not doing it right, and that's why they need to get psychiatric medication, and it's all poison. And if you do that, then you're just like, you're not actually showing up to your et cetera, et cetera. And I've seen this sort of ideology getting in the way of common sense. And so although I do generally feel like I see psychiatric intervention as among the last line of responses, the idea that we would just completely cut it off as an option to, bolster this ideology, it feels ludicrous and harmful. And
yeah, I mean, I would hate for anything I've said to be construed as being anti-medication when it's appropriate, because medication, is a very useful tool when it is appropriate. Historically, medication has been used far, far too much. As a psychiatrist, I probably took more people off unnecessary medication than I started on necessary medication. So many people are on unnecessary medication. And, it's harmful in a number of different ways. but the right medication at the right time is, of course, is useful and appropriate. And the right medication at the right time, followed by other appropriate treatments, is a really good combination. If people are in a state where they cannot process and things are spiraling out of control, then they need some help to get back to a level where they can benefit from the support. They can use the psychological treatment. They can start processing. They can take care of themselves. They can make good decisions. I would hate for anything that I've said to be construed as anti-medication when need arises. I should maybe start off this evening by making that point.
Well, the point is strongly made now, and I appreciate
good.
it. I mean, I guess it's interesting because I didn't need you to tell me that, because I had the sense that I already understood that you had that sense of like, you're not anti-medication.
Yeah.
But I could also see how, in the context of this conversation, listeners might have misconstrued your position. So I really appreciate you clarifying.
Yes, good. I'm glad we've done that. Yeah.
So the second part of my question about the practicalities is, as somebody, first line, to somebody else who's entering into a spiritual type something, spiritual emergency, archetypal crisis, that is not at this point requiring hospitalization or psychiatric intervention, but that person is saying some things that are pretty far out there that may or may not line up with one person's understanding of what is real or potentially real. How do we support somebody in them being in a kind of delusional narrative, or delusionally attached to what might otherwise be a valid kind of philosophical narrative? I don't know if I'm making this clear here. I'm wondering about the difference between being supportive and what being supportive looks like when someone's saying some things that appear delusional or they seem delusional, and the difference between that and colluding with somebody's delusional states.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it would vary from person to person. Usually the most important thing is to maintain the relationship. So you don't want to get into a dispute about anything that's going to undermine the relationship. So usually in building that relationship, you're going to be pretty agreeable to what somebody's going to be saying. You might point out a few inconsistencies in a gentle way, but you're not going to get into an argument over what's real and what's not. The important ingredients of a relationship, supportive environment, try and have love in your heart, even if people are behaving in a way where, which might be quite challenging. Food and drink, safety, sleep are all important things, and you're hanging on in there. And if you can, you're trying to inculcate a mindset of what's going on here. This is important, but let's try and figure stuff out a bit. This is an opportunity, an initiation, even an invitation to do a bit of work in yourself. Which is very opposed to, the illness model that there's something wrong with you. So something about gentle encouragement. But where is this going? What does it mean? What's the work you're doing here? What's this journey that you're on? Where is this adventure taking you? I mean, this is really delicate work. If somebody's really in a crisis and maybe they're not thinking straight, maybe they've been quite difficult to be with, it's really difficult. But these would be the broad guidelines.
Yeah, I could see it being a very case specific and delicate balance between dismissal, support, and collusion in engaging somebody's narratives when they're in that kind of disposition. Yeah. So to finish us off, I have sort of like an open-ended question, and then I'll ask you about like, okay, where can people find more about what you do and that whole thing. Is like we just looked at some practical stuff, but is there anything specific for people who have listened this far through the interview, given what they've heard from you today? Is there anything specific that you really want people, if they take one thing from this conversation, even if you haven't already said it, that you want them to walk away with, having listened to this interview?
It's all about love. So love is the key ingredient in any work with expanded states, whether you're working with people, psychedelic therapy, or people in crisis, or whatever. If you can come at it with love in your heart, that is the most important. Of course, you need common sense. You need the tools. You need to take care of safety. You need your tools and your skill set. But important to work in yourself so that you can open yourself up to that love in your heart place. That's probably the most important work that we do as human beings. And to have love in our heart with ourselves as well, so we can do this deep work on ourselves, so we can get the healing that we all need as well. The places that we've been talking about tonight, we've kind of all got those places to a greater or lesser extent. And the more we can work on that, the more freed up we are going to be, the more creative we're going to be, the more loving we're going to be in our lives, the greater we're going to express ourselves, and the richer and more interesting our lives are going to be.
Thank you for that. Where can people follow more of what you do? Such as the IPT. I know you guys are doing regular workshops and webinars, but what social contact links would you like people to take before they leave?
Yeah, so just to say something about the IPT, the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy. I guess what we're trying to do is build a transformative community. So we're not kind of trying to sell anything or model a particular approach, or I'm retired from psychiatry. I'm not taking on patients, so I'm not sort of touting for business in any way. But a transformative community where people support each other in doing their deep work, and and go on to work with other people in a way that is compassionate and curious and growthful, because we need it. We need our transformative communities in the world right now. We have a world that is potentially dying. The ways in which we've been in the world have not been working. We need to get real. We need to do things differently.
And what's the URL for people to URL and various places for people to find the IPT and all that you're doing there?
So Institute of Psychedelic Therapy, so www.instituteofpsychedelictherapy.org.
Excellent. And do you have any social media that you send out through that people could follow?
We probably do, but I don't.
Fair enough. I'll look into it. And I'll look into it and post it with the show notes for this episode at jameswjesso.com. So, Tim Reed, thank you so much for your time today, for your work. I really appreciated this conversation, and I trust that my listeners will too.
Well, it's been great talking to you, James. And, I think we all really value the work that you do as well and what you're putting out there. So thank you very much.
And cut. Okay, that was this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. As you heard at the end there, I sort of retroactively got the links and all the social media things for the IPT and for Tim Reed, and they will be in the show notes of this episode at jameswjesso.com, episode 172. Wherever you're watching this, there should be a quick link over there. But if you don't see that link, you can just head to my website and just search 172 and you'll find it. Also, if you are on YouTube, you're watching this on YouTube, you might have noticed there's a pretty big uptick in videos that I've released recently. I merged the At Mine Clips channel with the main channel. which was not as streamlined as you might think based on that language, but I got all of those clips up there, and from here on in, we'll be releasing clips through the show. So hopefully some of the sections of this episode that you found value in, you will be able to easily share and pass along to others over the YouTube. And if you aren't listening or, watching this on YouTube and you're a YouTube person, please do subscribe to the show. Once again, this show is brought to you by people like yourself through Patreon and or through one-time donations. So if you're enjoying the show, please do head over to either Patreon or PayPal to leave me a little something to support the production of the show. If you're watching this on YouTube, you could also leave a super tip. That's an option. So thank you so much for doing that. Links to all forms of support can be found in the description of this episode, wherever you're checking it out. And that's all. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. And until then, take care.